Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into something pretty fascinating today.
Yeah.
It's all about how our brains, well, sometimes they kind of trick us, Like you probably heard of optical illusions, right? Those things where you see something, but it's not really what it looks like.
Right.
Well, we're going even deeper today. We're talking about cognitive illusions. These are the illusions that mess with how we think, how we make decisions, even how we see the world.
Yeah, and these cognitive illusions, they're not just fun little brain teasers. They actually tell us a lot about how our minds work, how they process information.
Exactly. For this deep dive, we've got all sorts of research papers and studies about these illusions. We're going to unpack it all, explore the different ways our brains can play tricks on us.
I think what's really important to remember is that these illusions, they're not like glitches in the system.
Yeah.
They're actually a sign that our brains are working exactly as they should.
It's like our brains are trying to be efficient, right? Like they're trying to take shortcuts to help us process information quickly. But sometimes those shortcuts, they lead to some pretty unexpected results.
Exactly. A great example of this is the default mode network. Have you heard of that?
The default mode network.
Yeah, DMN for short.
I don't think so. Tell me more.
Okay, so the DMN is basically a network of different brain regions.
Okay.
And it becomes active when our minds are kind of at rest, So like when we're daydreaming or just letting our thoughts wander.
So it's like the part of our brain that's always running in the background, even when we're not really focused on anything specific.
Exactly. And get this, the DMN is responsible for weaving together all our memories and experiences. It helps us create our sense of self, It's like the storyteller in our heads, constantly creating this narrative of our lives.
So it's helping us make sense of the world and our place in it, all that. That's pretty amazing. But how does this default mode network, how does it connect to illusions?
Well, think of it this way. The DMN, it's always making predictions about what's going to happen next, right? Based on our past experiences, And sometimes those predictions, well, they can be a little bit off, and that's when those illusions can sneak in.
So you're saying our brains are filling in the gaps, trying to make sense of things, even if they have to make some assumptions along the way.
Yeah, exactly. It's like trying to put together a puzzle, but with some pieces missing, right?
Right.
Your brain's trying to figure out the full picture, even if it has to, invent some of the pieces.
And sometimes those invented pieces, they're not exactly accurate.
Exactly. And this can affect not just what we see, but also how we think, how we make decisions. It's like our whole perception of reality can be influenced by these little assumptions and shortcuts.
Wow, that's kind of mind-blowing. So it's not just about our senses, it's about how our brains interpret that information too, right?
Exactly. And it's not limited to sight either. Our other senses, they can be tricked too,
Oh, like those sounds you hear, but there's nothing really making that noise, those auditory illusions.
Yeah, exactly. Or have you heard of the rubber hand illusion?
The rubber hand illusion, I'm not sure.
Okay, so basically, someone puts a fake rubber hand in front of you and they hide your real hand. And then they stroke both the rubber hand and your real hand at the same time. And after a while, your brain starts to think that the rubber hand is actually your hand.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, it's crazy.
That's wild. So our brains can actually be convinced that something that's not real is actually a part of our body.
Exactly. It just shows how powerful these illusions can be and how much our perception of reality can be influenced by what our brains are telling us. But you know what's even more interesting?
What's that?
These sensory illusions, they're really just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to talk about cognitive illusions, which are even more pervasive, and honestly, they can have a much bigger impact on our lives.
Cognitive illusions, huh?
Yeah.
Those are the ones that mess with our thinking, right? Not just our senses.
Right. Like, for example, have you ever noticed that, say you're buying something, like a new phone, and the first phone you see is super expensive?
Yeah, I guess.
Then, all the other phones, even if they're still pretty pricey, they seem like a better deal.
Right?
Yeah, I think I've experienced that, so what's going on there?
That's something called the anchoring effect. That first price you saw, the really expensive one, it basically sets an anchor in your mind.
Okay.
So now you're judging all the other prices based on that first one, even if that first price was, totally unreasonable.
So my brain is being tripped by a number. That's kind of scary, honestly.
It is, and it happens all the time with prices, negotiations, even in how we form opinions about people. That first impression, that first piece of information, it can have a huge impact on how we see things.
So it's like our brains are taking shortcuts again, relying on the easiest information available, even if it's not the most accurate.
Well, I wouldn't say they're being lazy exactly. Our brains, they're incredibly efficient. They have to process so much information all the time. Yeah, it's a lot to handle.
Right, so they've developed these shortcuts to help us cope. But yeah, sometimes the shortcuts, they can lead to biases and illusions, especially if we're not aware of them.
Right, it makes sense. I guess it's like our brains are constantly trying to simplify the world, even if that means oversimplifying sometimes. So, are there a lot of these cognitive illusions lurking out there? I'm kind of nervous to find out, honestly.
Oh, there are plenty more where that came from. Get ready, because we're about to dive into a whole collection of them. We'll explore how they work, how they affect our lives, and most importantly, how we can start to recognize them and maybe even overcome them.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's do it.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We were just talking about how our brains can kind of trick us with these things called cognitive illusions.
Yeah, and you were about to tell us about some more of them, right? I'm ready to hear more, even if it freaks me out a little.
Okay, well, let's talk about something called the availability bias.
Availability bias.
Yeah. Have you ever noticed how, like, if you hear about a plane crash on the news, you suddenly start feeling more anxious about flying, even if, logically, it's still super safe?
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like those images of the crash, they just stick in my head.
Exactly. That's the availability bias at work. Our brains, they tend to overestimate the likelihood of things that are, easy to remember.
Like things that are really vivid or dramatic.
Yeah, exactly. Even if those things are actually super rare,
So it's not just about how likely something is to happen, but also how easily we can think of examples of it happening.
Exactly. And this can affect all sorts of things, not just our fear of flying. It can influence our political opinions or even our investment decisions.
Wow. So it's like our brains are trying to create these shortcuts, these rules of thumb.
Yeah.
Based on the information that's most readily available, even if that information isn't really representative of the whole picture.
Exactly. And, speaking of filtering information, there's another cognitive illusion that's kind of related to that.
Okay, what is it?
It's called confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias, huh?
Yeah. Have you ever noticed how, when you have a really strong opinion about something, you kind of tend to seek out information that supports that opinion, even if that information is, maybe not totally accurate?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I'm totally guilty of getting stuck in those echo chambers on social media.
Yeah.
Where everyone's just agreeing with each other and reinforcing the same beliefs. It's comfortable, but I know it's not always the best way to get a balanced perspective.
Right. Confirmation bias, it basically makes us resistant to changing our minds, even when we're presented with evidence that contradicts our views. It's like we're wearing blinders,
Yeah, I get it. So how do we overcome confirmation bias? It seems like it would be really hard to break out of those echo chambers and actually engage with different perspectives.
It takes conscious effort, for sure. We need to actively seek out diverse viewpoints, even the ones that make us uncomfortable, and be willing to, question our own assumptions.
That's great advice. But it's funny, sometimes even when we are presented with evidence that contradicts our beliefs, we, double down even harder.
Right. That's actually a real thing.
Oh, is there a name for that?
Yeah, it's called the backfire effect. It's like our brains are saying, nope, I've already made up my mind, I'm sticking to it.
I guess it's kind of like protecting our egos, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to admit we were wrong.
Exactly. And it can be even stronger for beliefs that are really central to our identity.
Like our core values and stuff.
Yeah. Challenging those beliefs, it can almost feel like an attack on ourselves. But, even though these biases can be really powerful, we don't have to be ruled by them.
So what can we do about it?
Well, the first step is awareness, right?
Right.
Once we understand how these cognitive illusions work, we can start to recognize them in ourselves and in other people.
So it's like we're building up a toolkit of mental strategies to help us spot these biases.
Exactly. And the more we practice those strategies, the better we'll get at overcoming them and making more informed decisions.
I'm definitely feeling a lot more aware of my own mental shortcuts now, for sure. It's kind of amazing, but also kind of scary to think about how much our brains can influence our perception of reality.
Yeah, it is.
But knowing about these illusions, it's empowering, right?
Yep.
It gives us the ability to question our assumptions and see the world with a little more clarity.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process. We're never going to be completely free from biases, but we can at least start to understand them and mitigate their influence.
Okay, that makes sense. Are there any more of these illusions we should be aware of? So we're back, still exploring these cognitive illusions.
Yeah.
Starting to see them everywhere now.
Right. It's kind of like once you start noticing them, you can't unsee them.
Exactly. And you were saying earlier how these illusions, they can actually have a pretty big impact on our lives.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about, seeing a funny picture or hearing a weird sound. These biases, they can actually affect our behavior.
Like how?
Well, think about the availability bias we talked about.
Yeah.
Remember, that's the one where we tend to overestimate the likelihood of things that are easy to remember. Well, that can definitely influence how we see the world, right?
How do you see that?
Like, for example, let's say you're constantly seeing news stories about crime.
Okay.
You might start to believe that crime is much more common than it actually is.
Even if the statistics don't back that up.
Exactly. Your perception of reality is being shaped by the information you're exposed to, even if that information is biased or incomplete.
So it's like our brains are trying to create this story, this narrative of the world.
Yeah.
But sometimes that story is based on faulty data.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these biases, to actively seek out different perspectives, different sources of information.
So don't get stuck in those echo chambers we were talking about earlier.
Right. We need to challenge our own assumptions, be willing to consider alternative viewpoints, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Sounds like understanding these illusions, it's really essential for being a critical thinker.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about being more informed either.
What else?
It's about being more compassionate.
Oh, okay. How does that tie in?
Well, if we can recognize that everyone's perception is shaped by their own experiences, their own biases, we can be more understanding of people who see the world differently than we do.
Even if we disagree with them, we can at least try to understand where they're coming from.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that, hey, we're all susceptible to these illusions.
Yeah.
None of us has a perfect grasp on reality.
We're all just trying to figure things out.
Exactly. So next time you encounter something that seems a little off, a little too good to be true, take a step back,
Question it.
Yeah. Ask yourself, is this an illusion? Is my brain playing tricks on me?
That's great advice. I know I've learned a lot from this deep dive. It's definitely made me more aware of my own mental processes, my own biases.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's been fascinating and a little bit scary.
Yeah.
But definitely empowering, too.
Yeah. It's all about that awareness, right? That's the first step.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of cognitive illusions. We hope you've learned something new about how your brain works and how those hidden processes can shape your perception of reality.
And remember, keep those perceptual glasses polished.
That's a great way to put it. We'll see you on our next deep dive.